you know, you all have a hard job. Everybody does this time around. You know, there are 435 candidates running for President of the United States on the Republican ticket. And so it's not an easy thing to do, to sift through them and figure out, you know, who the right candidate is. There are a lot of really good people running. And so what I like to do when I have an opportunity to talk to folks is share a couple thoughts with you and then give you the opportunity to ask questions that are on your mind that might help you differentiate between the other candidates and maybe help you understand why you should vote for me.
Presidential hopeful and former Pennsylvania U.S. Senator Rick Santorum was in Sulphur Springs Tuesday at noon to address supporters and the curious at a fundraiser in the Civic Center banquet room. KSST's Jim Rogers had the opportunity to talk with Santorum.
If you were president, how would you want to lead, or how would you lead the nation in light of the terrorist attack in Paris?
I think this is one of the most important issues of this campaign, and that is how do you deal with radical Islam? And I think this is why it's so important that we have somebody who understands it, who is experienced in dealing with radical Islam and has a vision for how to defeat them. And with respect to ISIS, it's actually simple if you accept the fact that the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria is an Islamic state. And then all you have to do is read their books, because they are returning, they want to return to a 7th century caliphate. So we have to go back to the 7th century and understand how they operate, because that's their manual. And if you understand that, you know that they will use all means necessary to conquer the infidels, which would be us. And it's important for them to have legitimacy in the Islamic world. And the only way they have legitimacy is, now they have established a caliphate, is to maintain the territorial integrity of that land. So when the president says he's going to contain ISIS, it is music to ISIS ears. Why? Because to get legitimacy in the Islamic world, to get people like what happened in France to follow them, they need to maintain their territorial integrity. That's part of, if you go read their books, what is the key to determining whether this is a legitimate caliphate. And so what the president is doing by containing ISIS is validating ISIS as the new caliphate and encouraging other radical Muslims to join them. So the president is using the exact wrong strategy. And unless you admit that ISIS is in fact in a radical Islamic state and that's trying to recreate a 7th century caliphate, unless you deal with the enemy under those terms, you're going to make the wrong choices, as the president has. I won't make that choice. The choice I will make is to put sufficient boots on the ground, sufficient air and naval power, and we will take ISIS out of Iraq initially and then eventually out of Syria. But initially, we need to mobilize our forces using Iraqi Sunnis as well as Kurds, particularly the Kurds, and push them out of Iraq. That is the first step in this process.
You're in Texas. Immigration is an issue in Texas,
yeah,
obviously, as it is in most southwestern states. But immigration carries a lot of different things now. It's not
very different.
Latino.
No, people are not as concerned about what's going on at the border right now. They're being concerned about what this president is doing and bringing ISIS rebels into this country under the cloak of refugees. And we saw what happened in France. We heard what ISIS said. They have, in fact, infiltrated the refugees with ISIS militants, and they are now in Europe. And they said they're going to do the same thing here. The idea that we're going to take tens of thousands of Syrian refugees when we know that ISIS is going to be sneaking people in. They're not sneaking them in, we're letting them in. That cannot happen. We see just what a handful of militants can do in France. Imagine the damage that could be done here. I am absolutely against any refugees coming into this country for two reasons. That's one, but there's a second reason. by allowing, look, most of the people who are coming here are not radical Muslims. I accept that. Many of them are Christians. But we shouldn't take either. And the reason is, they have been driven out for a reason. ISIS doesn't want them there. ISIS is trying to eradicate Christianity from that region. ISIS is trying to eliminate moderate Muslims from that region. And so driving them out is exactly what they want. If we resettle them here in the United States, they'll never come back. And so what will happen? We will lose Christian areas that have been Christian for 2,000 years. We will lose any counterbalance to the radical Muslims that are in the region. We need to resettle them in the region for them to be able to move back and stay. The other thing is, these are two very different cultures. To transplant, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the United States, a Islamic culture en masse into this country is not going to work and will not be beneficial, particularly to Europe, which is now has a lot more problems there than we do. But it is not a good idea to either bring them here or, frankly, for them to go to Europe.
What do you see as the top two issues for your campaign?
I would say right now, I don't think there's any question, we're going to be going up against a Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, in the general election. We better have someone who doesn't see the Commander-in-Chief job as an entry-level position. We have most of the people in this race, all but one or two, myself and one other, have none of them have national security experience to speak of, and you're going to be going up against someone who has very, very deep national security experience at a time when our country is going to be looking for someone who's going to be steady at the till, not flip-flopping all over the place on issues. We just had, your senator today who, a little over a year ago said we should accept Syrian refugees, now saying we shouldn't accept Syrian refugees. That's, we can't have that kind of indecisiveness, inexperience in front of the First Lady of this country and in front of the former Secretary of State of this country. We have to have a stronger, more principled voice. I bring that to the table. I was the person that put the law in place, authored the law that put the nuclear sanctions on Iran. I actually passed a bill called the Syrian Accountability Act. So I've dealt with both Iran, Syria, Iraq, and those are the kinds of bona fides you're going to need if you're going to be successful against Hillary Clinton.
And a question for you, why is Paris attacks relevant to the USA Freedom Act?
Well, the ability for us to be able to have intelligence that can determine, let me just take a step back. As a result of Edward Snowden, what happened to our intelligence gathering capability was severely compromised. Now the enemy knows how we hear them and detect what their activities are. All of our methods have now been made available for the enemy, and so guess what they've done? They've adapted. And what we did with the USA Freedom Act as a revision to the Patriot Act was weaken our intelligence gathering capability at a time when it's been compromised in the first place. That's why I opposed it. That's why I believe, and I know there are many folks who are concerned about the Fourth Amendment. I'm concerned about the 14th Amendment, the right to life, because there are a lot of folks who are concerned about what the government might do. I'm concerned about what terrorists are doing, and we need to have the ability to gather information, find out who's communicating with whom, and do it in a way that we haven't done it in the past. And that means we're going to need information that we haven't gotten in the past, because the terrorists know the traditional means by which we gather information and are able to track them. And it's probably one of the reasons the terrorist act in Paris was successful, because they learned. We now have to learn and adapt. And if we aren't giving our intelligence community the ability to be able to do that, then we're going to be very vulnerable.
The nature of God is different. In Christianity, there was a big debate for a long time in Christianity whether God was all-powerful or God was all good. And which is he? Is God all-powerful or is God all good? And Christians determined, all Christian faiths now accept the idea that God is all-powerful, but limits himself to do only good. So God is both all-powerful and all good. In Islam, that is not the case. They came down differently on this one. Their God is simply all-powerful. But they cannot know, no one can know whether what God is doing is whether it's good or bad. It is the only way you determine whether God is blessing you and what you're doing is good and right under Allah is, are you successful? And so how do we determine whether the caliphate is a legitimate caliphate? Under Islamic law, is it successful? How do you determine whether it's successful? Is it winning? How do you determine whether it's winning? Are you holding on to your territorial land that you claim to be yours? And are you successfully waging war against the jihads, against the infidels? That's the determination. So now, think about this. In order for the Islamic world to accept ISIS as a legitimate caliphate, they have to hold on to their territory and they have to be successful in attacking the enemy. What is President Obama's strategy against ISIS? To contain them. To contain them. What does ISIS want to have happen? They want to be stable and contained. They want to protect their land. Because if they lose their land, they lose their legitimacy. And our president's policy is to let them keep their land. Worse yet, our president's policy is to let them keep their land while saying we are fighting them. By flying a handful of missions, air missions over Syria and Iraq that ISIS controls. So ISIS has the added attraction of saying we are maintaining our land and we are fighting the great Satan and we are winning.